The
What?
Ashford
hang
Board
on,
of
Bill.
Selectmen's meeting to order, noting that one of our members has been excused. He's had a funeral to attend to tonight, so Roger will not be joining us, but Catherine and I are here.
I will call to order a special meeting of the Willington Board of Selectmen. It is Monday, September 12th, 2022 at 6:01 PM. Note all members are present. All right, so we have just a couple of items on our agenda, two of them pertaining to the public hearing. So we'll move right to some discussions. Item 2, which is the joint meeting with the Ashford Board of Selectmen to discuss input received on the September 8th public hearing from members of both communities on potential use for the Cadlerock property. So I'll start a little bit, Bill, and then I hear from you, and then we'll go to our selectmen. I thought the meeting was well attended. You know, I always want to see more people in the room, but I think we had a good amount of discussion for this point in the process. And remember that we're looking for input to put onto our application for remediation funds from DECD. So the discussions at that public hearing and action we take today is not locking us into a permanent use for this property. It's simply to give us some direction to make our application more attractive. All right, so with that said, so you know, I heard a lot of similar conversation coming out of both towns. Both of our conservation commissions spoke to passive recreation. On the Nipmuc Trail goes through the northern portion, was it the northern portion of that property across the Willington section. And so to be able to utilize that in some manner, as well as hearing from some residents that they'd like to see some economic use development on the 44 frontage portion of the property. So, you know, what came out of that to me was a lot of mixed use conversation. But more importantly, some points that were brought up specifically from a resident in Mansfield was our need for a master plan. And I think that's really important for us to look towards, and if some of the funding can be used to help us develop that out of this portion of funds. And so I would ask Anne if you could speak to the possibilities of that in this application, or if there's one of the two of you.
Sure. I did go back and look at the proposed funding round, and it does include costs for remediation, abatement, all sorts of things, planning, engineering, and environmental consulting. So it clearly says planning, and therefore doing a master plan and seeking funds for purposes of a master plan for this property is within this funding round.
Good. Fantastic. Great. Before we open up discussion to everyone else, Bill, anything you want to discuss or?
No, I think you hit it on the head. I again always anticipate and hope for larger groups, but I think at count we had at one point almost 60 people joining us, which is I don't know how you do there in Willington, but it's a pretty good turnout in Ashford. And I think there was a lot of positive input, and an open discussion I think was healthy. One of the things that stood out to me was that and of course, everybody was able to present their wish list, but kind of stood out that there's a potential for us to consider multi-use. But I agree with what you're saying, Erica, and I think it was a consensus from a number of people there the other night, that we really need to know what is developable on that land in the form of a development analysis. I was a bit surprised after all these years to learn just last week that the wetlands had never been mapped. And I think it's things like those that are going to behoove us to make a better educated estimate on what can be actually applied and useful there. My thought is that once that's done, we're going to be able to accommodate a number, maybe absent the hunting element of it, but we may be able to accommodate a number of the objectives that people had and sort of their wish list. And that's what I'm looking forward to. And I'm wondering, Anne, what sort of specifics do you feel the application is calling for, or can we talk in the way of generalities regarding what the potentials are and what we're looking at?
I think that what we have to do is to go right down and go into this, that we held a public meeting jointly, certainly, to try to ascertain from the community the best direction for the property. And there were a number of suggestions that were made where we recognize that it is such a large piece. We want to be smart in the future use. And what came across during the hearing is that there is a need to develop a master plan so that we understand from more, given the stigma and the brownfields history associated with this property, we also are able to answer other questions about the developable nature of the property in order to remove the stigma associated with the brownfields piece. We still have more to do, clearly, to remediate the property. That's part of our grant, but we want now to marry our cleanup also with moving forward from a planning perspective to try to figure out the best possible use of the property that both towns agree with. And so that's what I think. I don't necessarily, and this is going to be the art of the drafting too, I don't want to marry the remediation completely to the planning, because maybe we'll just get planning dollars. I don't know. They may throw us some money because we're not going to ask for a lot in the big scheme of things. But I do want to have a degree of flexibility where we are seeking the remedial funds, but we're also seeking planning funds in order to move this to the next step. And so, and then we'd lay out what our process would be. So we'd have to go out for an RFP, we'd have to hire the right person, come up with some deadlines, milestones, so that certainly we can report back to DECD when it's accomplished.
So you're saying it's possible we only get planning money out of this round and maybe not some remediation money. I don't know that I'd be disappointed with that. I think I'd be okay with that.
I don't know
what. Give no money, I'd just as soon get planning money.
Yeah, I don't know. All I know is that there's a finite amount of money available. Deep really likes, and even, I'm going to be part of a conference with them on Wednesday. We had a planning meeting today, DECD rather, rightfully so, wants to have a shovel-ready site. They want to see development on a site. They want to see a town be married to a developer. That's all well and good, but you have to date first. And we need a matchmaker, and our matchmaker is planning. And so I think if we position that this is going to lead to the marriage with the developer, that's our position. And maybe they would segregate it and we get planning money as opposed to remedial money, particularly if our planning money is smallish in comparison. We may get something smallish for planning. Offhand, and I usually see the lists, and I haven't gone back for the several years. I don't know if they've awarded any planning only grants. It may be possible.
Catherine, you had a question?
I don't think they have.
Catherine.
I would be I think we should be making sure that we are able to start the remediation as soon as possible, because it's going to take a while to do that. And that doesn't preclude us from working on planning while that's going on. I would hate to have, as you said, Ann, you haven't seen anything where they've just given planning money. You know, I just would want to make sure that we have remediation up there front and, right in the forefront,
Right.
because we can't really do the kind of planning that we need to do without understanding what the wetlands are. We know we need to map those. Okay, so that's one of the things that has to happen, so that we can look at what potential, what options we have for use.
I think the remediation, I'm not saying we go in for planning alone. I think we could position it either or both.
And I'm saying if all we get is planning, then I'm happy with that. I just assume we get the remediation, but if they say, we don't think you're ready for this, or we have bigger projects that will take more dollars, but we at least will give you planning, I'll be happy with that. I think we need to go in for remediation. That's what we're hoping for, but I'll be happy with only planning dollars, better than nothing.
And remind me, Erica, the amount of money that we're going for here is 280,000. I forget what it was, 225.
I think it was
1,000?
300, Chris, the last time we talked.
That's
That's my thought too. Is that right, Chris?
That was approved in the capital projects budget, 300.
okay. And that was to include, it also includes attorney's fees
Attorney's fees and engineering.
and
Engineering.
engineering. Okay.
Liza or Jim?
Erica, did you put anything in your budget for that, or is that all in ours?
It's on yours.
Okay.
Well, no, because, and I believe that the reason being is it was all, we are doing this jointly, but it was like a deliverable to a town, not joint towns. Correct me if I'm wrong, Christine. Like the
I
last
think
grant.
last year's we had 275 in there.
Right.
And in our general discussion this year in our budget process, we thought to give ourselves a little more leverage in today's economy. Of course, it's gotten worse.
Sure has.
Give ourselves a bit of a buffer, but my tendencies are to go for both. I certainly would be happy with either. Just some general discussions that I've had with some commercial brokers and that, trying to get an idea of the value of that property and that. And everybody had something in common to saying, until we know actually what is available for us to use in that land, that's a moving target. So I really think that we're not going to know that until it can get a clean bill of health remediation wise, but that also doing this development planning or analysis is critical. I think they go hand in hand. Now Val also mentioned to me after the meeting the other night, and that there are some discretionary funds the DEEP has for planning.
Well, DECD, I'll follow up on that on Wednesday. That surprised me. I thought, we're in brownfields and brownfield programs, and that's how this property has been treated all along. I don't know what other programs maybe can be brought to bear here, or how you apply for those funds.
Is that
Okay.
the bar grant?
The what
Say it again,
grant?
Chris, couldn't hear you.
The bar grant, the one I showed you the other day.
No, this is, I got the impression it's something else
Discretionary funds.
entirely.
Yeah. When she
You
mentioned.
mentioned
to me-
discretionary, but I didn't, the meeting was over and I didn't have a chance
Yeah.
to get more of detail from her, but perhaps
Bill,
that's
I
something
think
we
we
can
had-
look into, Ann.
Yeah,
Similar conversations. Jim or Liza, do you have comments?
I have something, I was intrigued by the comment about having Yale manage the forest. I mean, that is a resource. Perhaps you can get some revenue or funding from that, maybe thinning out some certain sections that could help fund some development. I was told that there was a farmer who used to farm one of the fields there. I don't know if they were growing hay or crop or bedding or whatever, but
Corn.
That's a potential, you could lease that and you can get a little revenue coming in perhaps as you're looking at these things. I mean, we're trying to figure out, $100,000 here, there, whatever. I don't think a farm will give you $100,000, but anything that will help offset some costs is probably greatly appreciated.
I think that most of that was on the Willington piece, if I'm not mistaken. I know there was some on the Willington piece, no? Catherine, you're shaking your head. Do you think that was all in Ashford?
I know that at least one field was in Ashford. And it's over on it's away from Willington.
Carosi roadside?
Yeah, if you'll recall the pictures. And
Yeah.
he was growing corn. And there, certainly people, and there was some discussion that the Board of Selectmen had in Ashford about allowing people to come in and farm in there and, who that would be and what we would need to do in order to do that. Certainly a concern with corn is that they used pesticides on it. And the Conservation Commission kind of pushed back on that and said, hey, do you realize? And that is, it's always used with corn.
My recollection is there's actually 3 fields that have been utilized. They total a little over 20 acres over the past number of years. I guess Cadlerock had a side deal with a farmer. And one of them primarily is in Willington, I believe, and the other 2 are primarily in Ashford. Although one of those is one of the areas that they've indicated to us that needs final cleanup is about in the middle of one of those fields. This year, there's been no corn grown there, but there is wheat that's been grown in there, fine crop wheat. We did not harvest or anything, but to make your point, I think we're at a stage now that we ought to go forward in as many ways that we can. If Yale has some resources that they can help us with and are willing, I don't see any reason why we can't at least pursue or look into that also. I assume when would we anticipate this grant from the Brownfield grant being approved, Ann? Any idea?
It's usually in a few months. I'm looking to see if they've got December, the 1st or 2nd week of December is the
Okay.
tentative award announcements.
Okay.
So that's,
So between now and then, I think we do have time to look into this Yale situation. And if there are resources there to utilize them.
I'm gonna step in.
let me follow up with just,
Can I
I'm sorry,
speak?
Erica.
Second, please.
Oh, hang on, Ann. Eliza's gonna.
Thank you. I've had a couple of comments that
Oh,
I'd like
sure.
to say for a bit. First of all, I would suggest instead of Yale that we look at UConn. We have that, they're right down the street, and they are origins as an agricultural school. I think we would be remiss if we didn't connect with them first as a neighbor and a partner that does this work. So I think if we do go to a university to do some work, we should consider UConn first, being right down the street. Secondly, I think from what I heard from the meeting and what I think my personal reflections are based on all of the information that has been shared over the last few years that we've been discussing this, it sounds like there does need to be a lot of mapping work. And what I took away from the meeting the other day, and granted, my phone went out about 20-30 minutes before the end, so I didn't hear the last bit of the meeting on the 8th. But what I took away was a lot of different ideas for public use, recreational, passive recreation use. And I feel like from the conversations that we've had, what makes the most sense for the immediate term is to have discussions about assessing the land, mapping out the wetlands, the watercourses, the everything that needs to be mapped out so that we really understand the topography of the land. And then in the immediate term, begin opening up and considering that land for hiking trails, the more passive use, riding trails, whatever. that feels to me like the safest direction to go. And then consider future directions for any land, depending on what the mapping tells us, any land that could potentially be used for anything more intense than passive recreation. So those were the thoughts that I had taken away from the last meeting and all of our previous conversations on the subject.
So Liza, I think that's a great point, Jim. To the Yale point, that's something that was brought to us, and while I love the idea and the concept and the free portion got me, my consideration would be to partner with UConn first and see. And I think that the most important thing for us to do is I'd like to see that passive recreation. I think that's the first thing that we can do easily, right? But still, until all of the remediation is done, I would still suggest we hold off on that, but start working towards the potential of that. But until any remediation is done, we stick to no use, which brings we need to bring to the table the one item that was brought to us, which was hunting on the property. We know Cadlerock was allowing at least one individual who came, to the meeting and spoke on that. I have lots of liability concerns. We were not private residential owners allowing use. I have lots of reservations about hunting. So, I guess one of the things I'd like to take action on is until any further considerations are made, that we at some point, at least in the Willington piece, put some language into play in a formal manner that says there would be no hunting allowed.
I absolutely agree, especially if there's the consideration for other use. I feel like if it's open for hunting, it needs to be solely that or not at all that.
Right. Right. And so I would like to, at some point, from our side, from the Willington side, that we take some action, and we can do that in a regular meeting where we can have a hearty discussion about, why we get there. That at least saying at this point, there would not be, and that would not be an allowable use. And whether or not Ashford chose to take that up on their end as well.
Erica, immediately upon taking ownership or within a few weeks after that, we did post our property totally with no trespassing. I see you, Catherine. I'll get to you in just one second, but
We did as well, Bill.
I concur with your thoughts. Catherine, you had your hand up.
Yeah, for two things. One, you may not have been aware, but during our joint meeting with the public, the chat was open, and someone in the chat talked about how someone on that property was shooting, and apparently it endangered her child. She must have some kind of an adjoining property somewhere close enough. So there was a chat going on about that amongst the people that were on the meeting that were looking at the chat. Normally, we don't have a chat up because you don't want them all going back and forth while the meeting's going on. The other piece of it is, I don't know if everybody received what Ashford's Conservation Commission put forth as a proposal. It has some of the points you're talking about in it, and the intent was to attach it to the minutes from the meeting, but it hasn't. The minutes, will be going out shortly, I'm sure. But I don't know if you have that to work from.
We do. That was given to every member at the meeting. I had that to look at, and I've given our selectmen tonight copies of that. We all received the same information, Catherine, at the table. So, but for me, regardless of what happened with hunting in the past, we did put up the no trespassing signs. We immediately went out there. Once we were able to get on the property, I did physically go on to the Willington portion. But I think it's important for us to put down some language so that it's clear what our intent or what we don't want to see, at least right now, and put that out there, if that's the vote of this board.
I totally agree. I totally agree.
So I anticipate that we'd each take those actions separately, but have some discussion on specifically that item. But until such time as we say that is an allowable use, it should be understood that it's not. It would be trespassing. So I'd like to just formalize that. So absent any new revelation, I was happy to see that the people at the meeting were pretty much on the same page. We'd like to see some money be put back into the towns, some development if possible, and that plan will help us determine if some of that property is developable and ideal to a developer, I think along the 44 frontage area. And unless we have some new discussion from this group, I would encourage us to move to taking action on approving information to be included. Item 3. Anyone opposed?
No, but if I could just make a
Yeah.
couple of comments, Eric, and I agree, and I believe in passive recreation and certainly want to utilize as much as we can there, but you know, the fiduciary side of me, I had our tax collector do a estimate of our lost revenue over the past 15 years on that property. And on the Ashford side, granted, it's about 83% of the property. We calculate that we have not realized about $1.23 million on that. And it is certainly something, while we'll probably never recoup that, lends me to look at what may be able to be done on our revenue side of that property. And that's why my tendencies are to look at things that I think we can get multi-uses out. I mean, it's basically 351 acres. And while we know we're not going to make everybody happy, I think that we can utilize that to obviously some situation where hopefully on at least on the Ashford side and perhaps on the Willington, some revenue can be derived.
I agree. I think there's the ability, Bill, to have a little bit of both, right? To see what, you know, both of our conservation commissions would like to see out of a portion of that and be able to get some development in there that's going to put some money back on the tax rolls. I think there could be a balance. I think we all know that that's not going to happen until the remediation happens.
Right.
And until, you know, we develop a plan. And that's why my recommendation would be that we move forward with, include in this application, dollars for planning, as well as mixed use, both economic development as well as unknown economic development at this point, and passive recreation.
I agree. I agree with that, Eric. And I think we ought to do, you know, motions on both sides. I also, just before we forget it, I don't think either one of us will.
Oh, don't count.
I'd like to entertain a motion from the Ashford board to allow no hunting whatsoever on that property.
I'd like to make that motion.
Is there any further discussion on that? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Unanimous.
Sure.
Erica, did
So-
you want to make a corresponding?
Well, you know, I'm not going to make that. I mean, certainly if one of our other commissioners, the items we had on our agenda were pretty specific, in my opinion, to discussing what came out of the public hearing and then to take action on what to include in the remediation. So I would much rather, from my perspective, have that discussion. I'm not sure. Yeah, right, that there be an actionable item within our agenda that speaks to taking action of use of the property. And I just don't feel, from my perspective, that falls into the item set forth on this agenda. And because it's a special meeting, I can't add something, which is why, Bill, I said earlier, I'd hesitate to.
That's a very good point.
Your point's well taken, Eric.
All right, so what is our remediation of what we just did?
I would make a motion that we include language, and Christine will make it pretty language. Include language to ask for planning funds and remediation for mixed use, both passive recreation and economic development on the Cadlerock properties in Willington and Ashford.
Well, we're asking, I need to clarify that. We're asking, we've already asked for remediation funds. The
Okay.
last grant round. We did, and we were denied. The remediation funds are necessary regardless of whether we go mixed use, passive recreation, or residential or anything. So the remediation funds isn't a function of the use of the property, it stands alone.
Right.
The language we need, and then is just, you're looking for us to take action on what information we want included in the application for remediation. So the language then we want is the usage of the property, correct? Our intended,
Well, what we're saying is we now have a plan. A plan is to do planning. So that's
Okay.
better than just give us the money as we went in before, and then we'll figure it out. Now we get to say, we've held a public hearing. There's a number of ideas and concepts, and the concept that came forward is we need to develop a master plan for this property, ideally to incorporate mixed use, passive recreation to the extent that the property itself supports it. That's what we have to find out, and that's what we're going to do for the planning function. Because if we say we need remediation funds, the spectrum of mixed use to recreation, we don't have a plan in that way.
so you're saying in this
That's
round,
too
we're going
broad.
to ask for remediation funds? Because I thought that was our intent.
No, we are asking for remediation funds, but our plan now is planning
Plan, okay.
as opposed to as an end use. So, because we don't have an end use. We've got like 6 different ideas, all good ones. And obviously hunting is not one of the good ones, given the conversation, but all good ideas. So what came out of it is, our plan is to do a formal planning,
Okay.
master planning approach for the property. And to the extent, and I want to come back to this, to the extent we can leverage UConn or Yale, we would be seeking for additional support from those institutions. I'll just say, when they raised Yale and assuming, I think her name was Christine, assuming what Christine says, that she's been in contact and they're willing to go out and do some work for free, that would actually, if we were, may be beneficial to us, to say, now the town has made contact. We are able to get Yale, which would be a piece of the planning function, to do, I don't know what they do. They look at trees.
They were supposed to be
She
forestry.
suggested archaeological, Indian burial grounds. That's some of the work that has to be done. I don't know if they do that or not. It sounded, from what she said, maybe they do. But if we want to try to go to UConn to see if they would provide the same service, that's fine. Whatever you all want to do is fine.
Yeah, so I think it sounds like though we'd be helped with a little bit of direction. Rather than saying planning generally, say planning with the intention of working towards passive recreation and whatever other economic development purposes that the land would support.
Yes,
I like
that's
that.
for the planning
That's-
section, yes.
So I think it's more than planning. It's planning with the goal of going in the passive recreation and appropriate economic development. And that term appropriate is what we need to determine by the planning needs to help determine. So it's rather than just saying planning in general, because it does start to funnel down to an end use, which it sounds like they would probably like that from us.
And I'm not clear on how we're going to address the final remediation plan part of this. And I know last year we were turned down and it was waved in front of our face that we really didn't own the property, and we've both taken a commitment where we now own it. So the game has kind of changed. And we've taken the initiative and their lead on this ownership. I'm just not clear on your explanation on how we're going to address the remediation as well as the development portion of it.
Well, it's 2 different paths. We don't have a use at all for this property.
We have an idea of what we'd like to use it with, but we can't say this is the passive recreation we're committing to. That's what we don't have.
There's lots of
Well,
things.
actually, but I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. You're all over the board. You got passive recreational, you got commercial economic development, there could be affordable housing, that's like the spectrum of every development activity, with the exception of farming and hunting, that exists. So that's not the kind of goal that DEP wants to see when they marry remediation to development. They're
What is your,
looking for-
I'm
So,
sorry,
Ann,
what is
that's
your
why-
advice, Ann?
I think,
I think we need the remediation money. We've said all along, we want the remediation money. We have our paragraph, why we need the remediation money, and that it, we now own the property. We have estimated to be $300,000. It's rather independent, isolated form of remediation that may not be dependent upon an end use. However, next paragraph, our end use could be, based upon a public meeting that we had, the spectrum of passive recreation, hiking trails with the Blue Trails Network, economic commercial development, potentially affordable housing. But we need, as a town, to move forward with a master planning function that looks at those potential end uses and appreciates the fact, and we appreciate the fact, this property is highly stigmatized. And so the only way we're going to get any sort of meaningful developer development, or to know if passive recreation, hiking trails, community gardens is appropriate, is to try to remove the stigma, develop a master planning function for this property. That's the first step. Then we have to see what the market and what the communities want out there. Because right now we don't know, but we have to remove the stigma, the brownfield bad juju that exists with this property. And we're going a long ways, but we're not done.
for sake of moving us in a forward discussion here, the action we're looking to take is just to agree to put language on developing a plan as part of the brownfields grant application.
Right.
Right, so
As part of the remediation,
correct.
yes.
So I move that we include language to allow for developing a plan for future use of the Cadlerock property in the 2022 Municipal Brownfields Grant Program application for remediation. Is there discussion? This is on the Willington side.
No.
Discussion. So all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries.
Well, I think that our motion should be reflective of your motion. So Catherine, if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah,
Either
the only other thought that I had about it was, is it a plan or a master plan? So no, I'm
Maybe.
fine with making that motion. I just thought master plan would show that it was more encompassing. So I'm making the same motion that Willington made,
Okay.
so that we are in
I'll-
perfect alignment.
I'll second that. Is there any more discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, we're by that.
Yeah, so I will say that as Anne develops this into language, I think, she's heard perfectly clear from us that we all believe in a master plan as the way, which is why I was pretty generic in including language that allowed for, so in her language, I think she'll take our. All right, we have
Okay.
one other item on the Willington side of this agenda. I don't know if you all had anything more on yours.
No, we're done and we thank you. It's always nice working with you folks and
It's always nice
I
working with you, Bill.
I will entertain a motion for adjournment of the
Yes,
Ashford portion.
So moved.
Second. Thank you very much, folks. Have a good evening.
Folks, you as
And
well.
Chris, thank you.
Thanks,
Yep,
everybody.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Anne.